5 years after a man vanished without a trace in the tangled wetlands of East Texas, a hunter stumbled upon something lodged in the shadows of an abandoned beekeeping shed. Inside a weathered wooden box, under layers of brittle comb and the hum of living insects, lay a human skeleton. The discovery would unearth an investigation long thought to be buried in the mud and reveal a story far darker than anyone imagined. The air that summer evening was thick enough to taste, heavy with the sour green scent of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. It was late July, the kind of day where heat pooled low over the swamp like a slow-moving tide, swallowing sound. Melissa Grant was finishing her shift at the small-town diner when she noticed the time. Her brother, Eric, was supposed to have called by now. He always did when he went out for one of his solo fishing trips, not because she demanded it, but because it had become their unspoken habit. A quick text, sometimes just a photo of his catch and the marsh beyond, proof of a day well spent. But as she drove the short stretch of road home through the darkened pines, her phone remained stubbornly silent. Eric Hayes was 42, wiry and quiet, and more comfortable with the whistle of wind through cypress knees than with the chatter of people. He'd spent his life in these swamps, first as a game warden, then later as a wildlife photographer. His skiff was practically an extension of his body, a narrow aluminum hull with a small outboard motor that could slip between stands of reeds where others wouldn't dare. That afternoon's trip had been nothing special on paper. He'd planned to launch from the old bait shack dock, drift out toward Catclaw Bend, and set up along a secluded inlet he'd been photographing for weeks. Melissa knew the spot, a hidden corner, where egrets congregated at dusk and where Eric swore the sunsets turned the water to fire. He'd promised to bring back a few fresh bream for their mother, who lived in a small trailer a mile from Melissa's place. Now, pulling into her driveway, Melissa told herself he'd probably lost track of time. The swamp had a way of bending hours into something slippery and unmeasurable. Maybe he'd headed straight home, tired and sunburnt, with his phone dead from a day in the heat. Still, the absence pressed at her. When she tried calling, the ring was swallowed immediately by voicemail. By morning, the unease had shifted into something sharper. Melissa drove to the dock where Eric usually launched. The bait shack was shuttered, the boards bleached and warped, but the dock still jutted into the tea-colored water. His truck was there, parked neatly in the shade of a drooping willow, keys gone, windows up. The skiff was missing. She waited, scanning the channel for the familiar silhouette of its bow. When an hour passed without movement, she called the county sheriff. Search and rescue moved quickly as one can, in a place where the land itself seems designed to keep secrets. The swamp was a labyrinth of flooded timber, narrow bayous, and reed-choked lakes, where even the most experienced boaters could vanish if their engine failed or a sudden squall rolled in. Deputies launched airboats, their fans roaring as they skimmed the surface, pushing deep into side channels marked only by half-submerged stumps. They called his name into the endless green. Volunteers waded the banks, probing the mud with long poles, eyes scanning for any sign. A shirt snagged in a branch, a boot print in the muck. From the air, a state police helicopter traced lazy circles over the water, the glare off its rotors flashing between breaks in the canopy. On the second day, they found the skiff. It was wedged against a stand of cypress roots in a narrow cut north of Catclaw Bend, the motor tilted up and silent. Inside lay Eric's fishing rod, tackle box, and camera bag, the lenses still dry. His phone was in the bow under a folded tarp, battery dead. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned gear, and no fresh gouges in the aluminum hull. It was as if he'd simply stepped out and vanished into the water. The first working theory was a gator attack. The region was home to some of the largest alligators in the state, and while they rarely targeted humans, the possibility couldn't be dismissed. But days of dragging the channels turned up nothing. No clothing remnants, no blood, no trace. By the end of the first week, the official search wound down. The swamp kept its silence. Melissa refused to accept it. In the years that followed, she returned to the water again and again, sometimes with friends, more often alone, pushing deeper into backwaters she and Eric had once explored together. Each time she told herself this trip might be the one that would yield a clue. Each time she came home empty-handed. The case faded from headlines, replaced by fresher tragedies. But for Melissa, the absence remained a constant undercurrent, as much a part of the swamp as the hiss of cicadas at dusk. And then, in late August 5 years later, the call came. A hunter, scouting for feral hog sign along the edge of a long-forgotten apiary, had peered into a weather-beaten beehive box and seen something pale and unnatural beneath the honeycomb. He'd expected maybe a skull from a raccoon or a deer. Instead, wedged into the warped wood was the unmistakable curve of a human jawbone. The bees, long gone feral, had built their hives around and over it, amber light filtering through the comb like stained glass. The skeleton inside had been there for years, and the sheriff's office had reason to believe it belonged to the man who disappeared into the swamp and never come back. The discovery site sat deep in a stretch of marshland most locals didn't bother with. A half-mile from the nearest navigable channel, the beekeeping shed was a relic from another era, when the land had been drier, and men kept hives along the edge of the pines. Now, the structure leaned sideways under the weight of years, its corrugated metal roof rusted through in jagged holes that let shafts of light spill across the dirt floor. Deputies moved slowly, mindful of the lingering bees. Even without the insects, the air inside was thick, carrying the sour tang of old wax and rotted wood. The hive boxes were stacked 3 high against the back wall, their paint long since peeled away to bare grain. The skeletal remains were curled inside the bottom box, the rib cage collapsed inward, bones stained with the same deep amber as the comb around them. At first glance, it was impossible to tell how the body had come to be there, or why. The coroner worked methodically, each bone lifted and bagged under the watch of crime scene techs who photographed every angle. The skull showed no obvious trauma, but several ribs were cracked clean through. Some breaks were old and weathered. Others, the coroner noted, might have occurred around the time of death. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with decades in the county, stepped outside and lit a cigarette despite the late summer heat pressing against the air. "If it's him," he said quietly to one of his deputies, "that means he didn't drown out there. He made it to land." The thought hung heavy. The swamp swallowed people often enough, but to make it ashore and still end up here meant something else had happened, something deliberate. Melissa was at her kitchen table when she got the call. The sheriff's voice was careful and measured, but she caught the tremor underneath. "They'd found remains in the swamp," he said. "Could be Eric. They'd need her to come in and answer some questions, and maybe bring any dental records or old medical files she could find." She didn't speak for a long moment, staring at the steam curling off her untouched coffee. Outside, the cicadas droned in the midday heat. She thought of Eric's truck, sitting abandoned by the dock, and the neat row of his belongings in the skiff. She thought of every trip she'd taken into that maze of water, scanning the tree lines for a flash of movement that might never have been there at all. "I'll be there in an hour," she said finally. The news spread fast in town, faster than Melissa expected. By the time she reached the sheriff's office, a pair of local reporters were parked across the street, cameras idle on their laps. Inside, she sat across from the lead investigator, a lean man with windburned skin and eyes that didn't give much away. He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were photographs from the scene. The beehive box, the bones curled within, and the light slanting through the gaps in the roof. Melissa studied them without speaking, her gaze lingering on the curve of the jaw and the long bones of the legs. She recognized the narrow slope of the shoulders even under the distortion of time. "It's him," she said finally. The investigator nodded once, then leaned back in his chair. "We're going to run DNA to be certain, but yeah, that's our thinking too." The question that followed was inevitable. Did she know anyone who might have wanted to harm her brother? Melissa hesitated. Eric had no known enemies, no debts, and no disputes that she knew of. he kept to himself, more often in the company of birds and alligators than people. But she remembered something, a story Eric had told her a month before he vanished. He'd been photographing a remote stand of cypress when he'd come across an old shack tucked back from the water. There'd been signs of recent activity, fresh boot prints in the mud, the faint smell of smoke. When he'd approached, a man had stepped out from the shadows, rifle slung over his shoulder. The encounter had been brief, words curt but not overtly threatening. Still, Eric had said the man's eyes were sharp and measuring, like he was weighing something. He'd told her to be careful around Catclaw Bend, that some people out there didn't take kindly to strangers. The investigator's pen tapped against the table. You remember what he looked like? Melissa described him as best she could. Tall, rangy, sun-leathered skin, maybe late 40s at the time. Wore a faded camo cap, pulled low. The sheriff's office had no shortage of men who fit that description. But in the weeks following the discovery, one name began to surface in hushed conversations among deputies. A trapper who'd been living illegally on the fringes of the swamp for years, known for keeping to himself and for making trouble when pushed. He'd been questioned once before in connection with missing livestock and illegal hunting, but nothing had ever stuck. A search warrant was issued for his property, a scatter of weather-beaten trailers and sheds half swallowed by the swamp. Deputies found the remnants of old Beehive boxes there, stacked haphazardly near a tangle of rusting traps. In the corner of one shed was a fishing net, its mesh frayed but still stained dark in places. Forensics would later confirm the fibers matched those found tangled in Eric's skiff. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall that had stood for 5 years. The sheriff knew cases like this didn't solve themselves. The swamp might keep its secrets, but people didn't forever. And somewhere in those endless miles of water and shadow, someone knew exactly how Eric Hayes had ended up in that Beehive box. The break came 2 weeks later, not from forensics or a sudden confession, but from a man sitting at the end of a bar in a roadhouse off Highway 69. He was half drunk and talking too loudly, the way people do when they're trying not to sound afraid. A deputy on his night off happened to be nursing a beer 2 stools down, and at first the man's rambling meant nothing. But then he mentioned the bees, how they covered it all up, how you couldn't even see him by the end. The deputy didn't interrupt, just listened as the man drifted between boast and regret. The bartender, tired of the noise, cut him off and told him to go home. The deputy followed him outside, letting the door close before flashing his badge. An hour later, the man was sitting under the 2 bright lights of an interview room. His name was Wade Pritchard, a part-time trapper and sometime handyman who floated between swamp camps. He claimed he'd heard the story from a guy who knew a guy, but the details he gave matched elements of the crime scene that hadn't been made public. The angle of the skull in the box, the way one arm was tucked beneath the ribs, and the remnants of wax fused to the bones. Pressed harder, Wade admitted he'd done odd jobs for the man deputies had been watching, a recluse named Carter Dole. He painted a picture of a man who didn't welcome strangers, who believed the swamp belonged to him and him alone. Carter ran traps, tended to wild hives, and kept a watch on the inlets with a set of battered binoculars. Wade claimed that in the summer, Eric disappeared. Carter had been in a foul mood over someone messing around near his place with a camera. Wade didn't say outright that Carter had killed him, but the implication was heavy in the air. Investigators obtained a second, more targeted warrant. This time, they focused on the old apiary site itself, sifting through the soil beneath the remaining hive boxes. In the damp earth, they found the corroded remains of a belt buckle and the rusted outline of a folding knife. Melissa later identified both as belonging to Eric. The knife had been a gift from their father when Eric turned 18. The buckle, etched with a simple heron motif, had been something he wore almost daily. Neither object could explain exactly what had happened that day, but their presence in the shed tied Eric to the place in a way that was impossible to dismiss. The coroner's report finally arrived, its language clinical yet grim. The skeleton bore multiple rib fractures, but none had been fatal by themselves. There were no signs of drowning, no silt in the sinuses, no waterlogged bone patterns. Instead, there was evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, a depression fracture, consistent with a strike from a heavy object. The injury would have been incapacitating, if not immediately fatal. For investigators, it was the moment the disappearance shifted fully into homicide. The swamp, once a silent accomplice, now whispered fragments of the truth. Deputies brought Carter in for questioning. He arrived in faded jeans and a sweat-stained shirt, eyes hooded beneath the brim of his cap. In the interview room, he answered questions with a slow drawl, his gaze drifting to the corners of the ceiling, as though studying the tiles. He admitted to knowing the old beekeeping site, said he'd kept hives there years back, but denied any involvement in Eric's death. When asked about the fishing net found on his property, he shrugged, saying nets passed hands all the time out here. The belt buckle and knife? Never seen them before. But as the conversation wore on, cracks began to show. When confronted with Wade's account of his anger toward a photographer, his jaw tightened. "Man shouldn't have been poking around," he said. "You start sticking your nose where it doesn't belong in these parts. Bad things can happen." The line between warning and confession was thin. Investigators pushed, but Carter stayed just shy of admitting anything. Without a witness to the act or a direct link placing him at the scene with Eric, the case was still circumstantial. The sheriff's office needed more. That's when Melissa stepped in. She knew Carter by sight, everyone in the county did, but she'd never spoken to him directly. Still, she agreed to work with investigators on an approach that might loosen his tongue. It was risky, but sometimes the only way to pull truth from a man like Carter was to let him think he had the upper hand. One evening, she drove to the bait shack dock, the same place Eric had launched from on his final trip. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, the sky low and bruised. She knew Carter often passed through here to sell fish or pick up supplies. Sure enough, after 20 minutes, his skiff appeared from the bend, its bow cutting a lazy path through the brown water. He tied up without a word, but his eyes flicked to her as he stepped onto the dock. "Heard you've been asking about me," he said after a moment. Melissa kept her voice steady. "I've been asking about my brother." He studied her for a long beat, then glanced out over the water. "Swamp don't give back what it takes," he said. "But sometimes it keeps things safe." It wasn't an admission, but it was the first time Carter had linked himself, however obliquely, to Eric's disappearance. She left without pressing further, the words replaying in her mind all the way home. For investigators, it was another piece, not the final one, but a thread they could pull, and they knew if they pulled long enough, the whole thing might come apart. The breakthrough came not from Carter himself, but from the swamp's slow erosion of secrets. In early October, a cold front dropped the water levels lower than they'd been in years, exposing long-buried debris along the fringe of a channel less than a quarter-mile from the old apiary. A volunteer with the search and rescue unit, out checking on duck blinds, spotted something tangled in the roots of a fallen cypress. It was a torn scrap of fabric, sun-bleached and rotted, but the faded green pattern still showed through the same shade as the shirt Eric had been wearing the day he vanished. The fabric was wrapped around a section of nylon cord knotted twice, as though it had been used to bind something. Forensics confirmed that the weave matched clothing Melissa identified from Eric's closet. The cord, stiff with age, bore tiny flecks of what the lab determined was beeswax. It was the kind of forensic fingerprint that could tie the body to the apiary beyond doubt. Investigators returned to Carter's property, armed with the new evidence. This time, they didn't ask for his cooperation. They took him into custody, under suspicion of murder. In the stark, fluorescent-lit interview room, Carter kept his eyes low, his hands folded loosely on the table. The lead investigator slid a clear evidence bag across to him inside. The fabric and cord lay coiled like a dried snake. "We found this a few hundred yards from your old hive site," the investigator said. "It's covered in beeswax, just like the boxes you used to keep there." Carter's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. The silence stretched until the investigator leaned in. You know what this means. He made it to land. He didn't drown. And you were the last person to see him alive. For the first time, Carter looked up. His gaze was flat, almost bored, but there was a flicker of something else beneath it. You think you know, he said slowly. But you don't know the half of it. The confession didn't spill out in a rush. It came in fragments, drawn out over hours, a patchwork of grudges and justifications. Carter claimed Eric had been trespassing near the hives, photographing without permission. They'd argued, voices carrying over the still water. Carter said Eric wouldn't back down, and when he tried to take the camera, a scuffle broke out. He described the sound of the blow almost clinically, as if narrating someone else's actions. The dull crack, the way Eric had crumpled to his knees. He insisted he hadn't meant to kill him, only to teach him a lesson. But when he realized the extent of the injury, panic set in. Carter dragged the unconscious man into the shed, thinking to hide him until he could figure out what to do. But Eric never woke. By morning, Carter said, the bees had already begun their work, crawling over the still form, sealing the spaces between bone and box with wax. He left the body there, convinced the swamp and the insects would erase what he'd done. The investigators listened, their recorders capturing every word. Melissa was kept away from the room, but when they told her afterward, she sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall as if trying to see through it. The trial would come months later, but the prosecution's case was already forming. With each detail, Carter surrendered. The beehive box, the wax-covered bones, the personal items buried in the dirt, each piece fit into a grim mosaic. The swamp, patient and unyielding, had preserved more than Carter ever intended. Back at the apiary site, the recovery team continued their slow excavation. The ground yielded small artifacts missed in the initial sweep. A rusted thermos cap, the warped frame of a camera lens, and fragments of leather from a boot. Each was bagged, labeled, and added to the growing body of evidence. The sheriff visited the scene one last time before the site was sealed. Standing in the doorway of the leaning shed, he took in the filtered light through the holes in the roof and the lingering hum of bees in the distance. He'd worked in this county long enough to know that the land remembers. Sometimes it remembers too well. In town, word spread fast again. People spoke of the beehive box in hushed tones, glancing toward the swamp as though it might be listening. Some said Carter had always been dangerous. Others swore he'd been pushed too far. But for Melissa, the noise didn't matter. What mattered was that the years of searching, of unanswered questions and dead ends, had finally led to truth, ugly and incomplete though it was. When Carter was led from the courthouse after his arraignment, photographers shouted his name. He kept his head down, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. Melissa watched from a distance, her hands gripping the railing until her knuckles whitened. She knew the trial would force her to hear the details again, to see the photographs laid out in clinical sequence. But she also knew she'd be there for every moment. The swamp had kept Eric's secret long enough. Now it was her turn to make sure it was told. The trial began the following spring, under a sky that felt too bright for what was being said inside the courthouse wall. The prosecution laid out its case with the slow, deliberate pacing of someone stacking stones, each piece of evidence heavy and immovable. They showed the jury photographs of the beehive box as it was found, the curve of the ribs under amber light, and the warped wood that had kept it secret for 5 years. They brought in forensic experts who explained how beeswax could preserve organic material, sealing away not just insects, but time itself. They called Melissa to the stand, her voice steady as she described the day Eric left, the sound of his laugh, and the kind of man he was. She did not cry. She had done all her crying long ago. The defense tried to paint Carter as a man defending his land, a reclusive trapper caught in an accident that spun out of control. But the recorded interviews, the recovered items, and the damning fragments of his own words told a different story, one of choices made and chances refused. After 8 days of testimony, The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was silent, except for the creak of wooden benches. Guilty of second-degree murder. Carter showed no visible reaction, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For Melissa, the verdict brought no joy. It wasn't about winning. It was about closing the gap between what she knew in her bones and what the law would finally say aloud. After the sentencing, she returned to the swamp one last time before the summer heat settled in. She launched Eric's skiff from the same dock, the motor's hum echoing off the cypress trunks. The water was low, the air carrying the resinous smell of pine mixed with the faint sweetness of wild honey. She drifted past Catclaw Bend, past the inlets where egrets stalked in the shallows, until she reached a clearing where the sky opened wide above the water. There, she cut the engine and let the boat rock gently in the current. She spoke to him then, not loudly, just enough for her own ears. Told him they'd found him, that he could rest now. Told him she'd keep his photographs safe. Told him the swamp had given her something back after all. In town, the old apiary shed was dismantled. The boxes were burned, the wood collapsing into ash that lifted briefly in the breeze before vanishing. The land was left to the elements, and in time, the swamp would reclaim it fully. But for those who knew the story, it would always be a place where silence had a weight and the hum of bees carried more than just their own secrets. The case became another chapter in the county's long ledger of disappearances and recoveries, a reminder that out here, time moves differently. The swamp is patient. It waits, it keeps, and it reveals, but only when it chooses. For Melissa, life settled into something like normal. She returned to her work at the diner, tending to her mother, spending quiet evenings sorting through Eric's old prints. She framed a few and hung them in her living room. Sunsets over still water, the white flash of an egret in flight, and the strange beauty of cypress knees rising from the shallows. They were pieces of him she could keep without the ache of wondering. The years had taken enough. The night before the anniversary of his disappearance, she walked the edge of the swamp at dusk. The air was warm, the cicadas loud. Somewhere in the darkness, a barred owl called, its voice low and resonant. She stood there for a long while, listening, until the light was gone. And for the first time in 5 years, she didn't feel like she was waiting anymore. In the end, the story of Eric Hayes was not just about a man lost to the swamp or about the strange, terrible way he was found. It was about the persistence of those who refused to stop looking, the way truth can rot under the surface and still be pulled into the light, and the fact that even in the quietest places, there are voices that will not be silenced. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of disappearances, investigations, and the secrets hidden in the most unexpected places, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one.